Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Our topic today is getting started in parapsychology, and I'm very honored to be with one of the world's premier parapsychologists, Russell Targ, who is the co-founder of the remote viewing program at SRI International. Russell is also a laser scientist and is the author of many books, including The Reality of ESP, Do You See What I See?, his autobiography, Mind Reach, The Mind Race, Mind at Large, Limitless Mind, and The Heart of the Mind. Welcome, Russell.
Happy to be here. It takes a physicist to write all these books about mind.
It's a very interesting topic, and of course you've lived a fascinating life. I know that there will be people in our viewing audience who are young people thinking maybe they'd like to have a career such as you have had in parapsychology, and I think it'll be very instructive to talk about how you began. And I know in your case, it goes back in some ways to your earliest childhood.
Well, my earliest childhood, I grew up in Chicago, and I was interested in magic and tricks. Every kid is interested in tricks. Mm-hmm. And my father was a bookseller in downtown Chicago, and next to his store was a trick store, Tricks and Jokes. And my father would bring home for me little magic tricks, how to make the penny disappear, how to turn nickels into dimes, mm-hmm. sort of thing an 8-year-old can do, and then hand the apparatus back to the person you're fooling, mm-hmm. your customer. And every kid likes to fool adults. So for my earliest years, I was very interested in magic and that kind of close-up table magic for children. Mm-hmm. And then at the age of about 8, we moved to Cleveland from Chicago. In Cleveland, I got a little more serious. My father was publishing books by Thurston, who was a Ohio-based magician of some note. Yeah. And I got to see the great Blackstone on the stage. Mm-hmm. And my father and I got to talk about how did that woman actually disappear? We don't really know, but what must have happened? She didn't vaporize. Where could she have gone? Yeah. And I began to get an idea that you can use your analytic skill to decompose some of the things that seem magical. And about that time, my father brought me a Blackstone magic kit with linking rings and balls and cups and balls, that kind of thing. And I became a pretty serious child magician, mm-hmm. which I pursued for some time. In the mid-40s, we moved to New York. And I was 12 years old then, and I could go to 42nd Street and haunt the magic shops where professional magicians would buy their tricks. And down in the basement was Hubert's museum, mm-hmm. Hubert's Flea Circus, yeah. And I could stand right in front of a magician doing tricks on the little table in front of me. Uh-huh. And of course, all my life I've had very poor vision. So the opportunity to stand right in front of a magician for as long as I wanted, my quarter would keep me in this place all day if I wanted to. So I could see magic in the basement and then go up to the magic store, hobnob with the magician, and then for several years I was doing magic on the stage in New York for birthdays and art openings and that sort of thing, until I got to be 14 years old. And in my biology class at Newtown High School, an older student, Bob Rosenthal, came in, and he wanted to show us about ESP work going on at Duke University.
He would have been like 15.
That's right, a big 15-year-old.
Who has subsequently become quite a prominent psychologist.
Yeah, he discovered that the experimenter, the researcher, has a profound effect on what he finds in a laboratory. He invented the idea of the experimenter effect. And there are many, many famous examples. He created a whole branch of psychology involving the experimenter effect.
Yeah, I think he's well known for the Pygmalion effect in education, where there's a digression, but we'll mention it briefly, where teachers were told that certain students were brighter than others, and the teachers responded by favoring those students, if I recall correctly.
And at the end of the semester, the so-called late bloomers actually had up to 10 points improvement in their IQ, even though the children were all randomly chosen. Really a cautionary tale for prejudging your students.
So
Rosenthal showed us these ESP cards and had us guess cards and explained what was going on at Duke University. And that was a transformative experience for me because I realized that all my years of fake magic were really in the background to people at Duke University doing real magic. So I really threw away my childish stage magic ways and shortly took the subway to the American Society for Psychical Research down Central Park South and visited them. They gave me a deck of ESP cards, and I subscribed to the Society's journal. The American Society for Psychical Research had a quarterly journal, and as a 14-year-old high school junior, I was up and running, beginning to study what the real magicians were doing.
Yeah. Now, I understand, for the benefit of our viewers, that journal is, I don't think it's being published any longer.
No, they fell on hard times. They published for probably 75 years, and now the whole ASPR is probably out of business.
Yeah, it's a shame. It had a wonderful history. If I recall correctly, William James, the great American psychologist, was one of the founders. But in any case, in your development, you made the leap from fake magic to what we might call real magic.
That's right. I began to do experiments and began to read about these kinds of things. Through high school, I actually had the image at a high school physics club as one of the advanced girls was giving a talk on the stage that someday I would be on that stage telling these people about psychic abilities. And I just had that as an image that came back to me years later when I was doing that exact thing.
A premonition.
That's right. It was a preview of what was going to happen at a later time.
Well, you were fortunate to live in New York City, where in addition to the American Society for Psychical Research, there was also the Parapsychology Foundation.
And many others, and the Theosophical Society that we'll talk about later. So in college, I was mainly concerned with playing bridge and studying physics, which were my two favorite things. I was always a very enthusiastic card player. And in fact, I was a tournament bridge player. And I would often make bids just based on my impression of how things were going to turn out. And I recall tournament director wanting to know if we had a special convention, unannounced convention. And my partner said, I don't know what that guy is doing. He just does whatever he feels like doing, but we have no convention.
What is a convention?
A convention would be when I nod my head, it really means spades, or when I refold my hand, it really means I've got hearts, even though I'm bidding diamonds. It's like a secret trick, other than the things that you're allowed to say, like one spade or two hearts.
So bridge partners use these
secret conventions to communicate more data than they're allowed to.
I see. In other words, you were using your own intuition or ESP at that time.
That's right.
Uh-huh. So in addition, it's fair to say, because you're mostly known as a researcher, but you've had your share of psychic experiences and a certain level of ability as well.
Yes, I have memories of playing cards and just knowing what was going to turn up next.
Mm-hmm.
And you can use that in Las Vegas. In a word, if you're playing blackjack, you can bet more on the hands where you think you're going to win.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't cost you anything, even if you have no ESP and you're betting more at random, it won't cost you anything. But if you've got a small amount of ESP and you bet $20 on the hands you think you're going to win and $2 on the other hands, you wind up making a lot of money and drawing a crowd because people quickly are attuned to what's going on. And that's a surprisingly effective strategy.
Mm-hmm. So when J.B. Rhine, back in the 1930s, began doing ESP experiments at Duke University using a deck of Zener cards, he was in effect modeling a kind of experience that many people have playing bridge or poker or other games of that sort, where they really can be using their ESP for profit.
That's right. We now know that card guessing is a singularly difficult kind of ESP task to do, rather than so-called free response tasks. For example, if I were to ask you, what is the number I'm thinking of from 1 to 10? You'd say, well, it's probably not a 1 or a 10, because he just said those, and he probably wouldn't pick a 7 because it's everybody's lucky number, and that's not remote. That's not psychic functioning. That's analysis.
That's guessing. Yeah.
Whereas if I told you I'm visualizing some place on the planet that I know pretty well that you've never seen, tell me about the place I'm visualizing. That's a very easy task, even though I'm choosing my place from an infinite number of places. That's an easier task than guessing a number from 1 to 10, and that has been the work that we did at SRI for 20 years.
On the other hand, when you're playing bridge, you're not thinking about a forced choice ESP test. It's a game. You're engaged in.
What's going to show up in front of you?
Yeah. So it has more, I mean, it's a real life situation. ESP experiments are contrived.
That's right. So I went to graduate school at Columbia, and
in physics.
Yep. And in the course of that, I was taken to a lecture at the Theosophical Society by one of my students, co-students, and we heard about Bridie Murphy, who was a supposedly reincarnated Irish woman who remembered a previous life, and I met a number of the Theosophical bigwigs at the time, including Dora Kuntz, who ran the Theosophical Society, and she was a psychic healer. And I became friends with her and discovered that she could locate magnets in her office. If I would hide a magnet, she could see where it was, because she told me that she had that psychic ability.
In other words, she was able to visualize the magnetic field.
Yes. And I became very interested in the Theosophical Society. They had an early journal of the Theosophical magazine in which Annie Besant wrote an article called Occult Chemistry.
Annie Besant being one of the founders, along with Madame Blavatsky, of the Theosophical Society.
So in 1895, Annie Besant in India was looking, in Theosophy, they believe you can experience the universe by your direct perception. It's a kind of pantheistic view. The universe is available, and it's available to your experience and your direct perception. And Madame Blavatsky had the idea that her two prodigious psychics, Charles Leadbeater and Annie Besant, could sit in front of a block of paraffin at the laboratory in Adyar, India, and describe the atoms. And they started with hydrogen because that's the lightest one. And they were able to describe hydrogen, which they drew in a peculiar ideographic form. And then so there's actually two other kinds of hydrogen, which they called occultium, which has one extra thing in it, atomic unit, and aderium, named after the city that they were in. So they had really discovered the two isotopes of hydrogen in the late 1800s, before the idea of isotopes even existed, let alone the discovery of those two isotopes.
And as a graduate student in physics at the time, you were able to recognize
I found
the
that very
significance.
exciting. I was so like, I didn't understand all of theosophy and the secret doctrine, but I understood these people are really onto something, that psychic abilities can go way beyond playing cards.
And I think it's fair to say, although the Theosophical Society is a rather small and obscure movement today, that historically speaking, they've had an enormous impact.
That's right, and they still have a sizable following in England.
I think there may be 5,000 members in the United States today.
They published my last book, for example. They published my Reality of ESP.
Quest Books, their publishing arm,
And I thought that was nice. After graduating, or I didn't graduate, I left Columbia. I had things I had ideas for experiments. In general, I'm not the smartest guy around, but I often have good ideas for what to do.
You got involved in pioneering work in the field of lasers at the very early stages when lasers were just being discovered.
I had 3 years of work in the field of lasers before there were any lasers. And that's because I was working at the Sperry Gyroscope Company in Great Neck, Long Island. I had an idea that you could see into a plasma, which is the heart of a fusion generating system. And I had the idea that you could use microwaves to penetrate that plasma, which turns out to be correct. So I got a job at Sperry building high-power microwave devices. And one of the things that I built contained a beam of electrons, and as I was the engineer, I got permission to add another appendage to this experimental tube where you could slow down the electrons, and a suitable person could then push that electron beam from one side to the other side. It was a slow cloud of electrons. And because it was all in vacuum with plates on both sides, I had the idea that you could move this very slow cloud of electrons from one side to the other, and that appeared to be correct.
Using, you mean the body?
Using your mind.
Using your mind.
Holding yourself still, but using your mind to move the electrons.
In other words, psychokinesis.
Psychokinesis.
Okay.
So this was my first rather esoteric ESP experiment, moving a cloud of electrons in a vacuum tube. And I actually rebuilt that a decade later at Sylvania when I moved to California, and published that in Edgar Mitchell's book. Edgar Mitchell's first anthology after returning from space was published by my father, and had a number...
Who was the editor-in-chief of Putnam's at the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this was a pretty convincing experiment. I published the graphs looking that here's our control and here's our control, and here a guy is thinking about it and he pushes them all on one side. Looks like an experiment, looks like a physics experiment.
It's a pretty convincing demonstration of psychokinesis, and at this point you're just a few years out of graduate school.
Yeah, I'm 22 years old. I'm a kid, but I've got the tools.
Yeah.
And at that time, I was also...
Were you the one demonstrating the psychokinesis?
No, I had another person. I make no claim for psychokinetic ability.
Okay.
Can do other things, but I can't do that, as far as I know. But I had become friends with Eileen Garrett, who was a famous New York medium at that time.
Who founded the Parapsychology Foundation.
Yeah, and I happened to meet her because my father had published her autobiography. And Eileen Garrett was very interested in a physicist who was pursuing psychic stuff. And I had read a book by Forwald,
Håkon Forwald,
who had built a dice throwing machine.
Mm-hmm.
That's what led me to Eileen Garrett. I had read this monograph that she published.
Yes.
Where Forwald had built a inclined plane, and then dice would tumble onto the table.
Mm-hmm.
And he was not trying to get ones or twos. He was trying to push the column of dice to the left or push them to the right.
He called it, as I recall, PK placement.
That's right. And it was this PK placement example that he had that actually made me think it would be easier with electrons.
Mm-hmm.
So I had really read Forwald's article that stimulated me to do with electrons what he had done with dice.
Mm-hmm.
But Forwald was an engineer, and he was a careful guy, so he would sit quietly with his hands folded and want the dice to go to the left or go to the right. And he published this monograph called something like Gravitation with Mind and Matter.
Mm-hmm.
That's approximately what the monograph was, published by Eileen Garrett.
Yes.
So I became friends with her, and she said, "Could you make one of those for me?"
Mm-hmm.
And I went back to my laboratory, and together with some technician help, we made an attractive wooden box with a metal chute that would deliver 10 dice onto a corrugated tabletop, and then a green felt landing pad. And with the press of a button, you could release all the dice. So the whole thing was very still. Everything is still, and you just press a button like on a cable release for a camera.
Mm-hmm.
The shutter would open and the dice would roll down the table, and people could try and move the dice to the left and the right. And Eileen Garrett and Carlos Osis, who was research director at the Parapsychology Foundation, used that for many years. In fact, her daughter told me that she used to play with that as a child. They had it set up as an exhibit at the Parapsychology Foundation.
And this was really the beginning of your work developing instruments for testing and measuring and even training ESP ability.
That's right. I was sort of I was a technically oriented person, and I would work with big things like this. Because of my very bad, I give an impersonation of somebody who could actually see what they're doing.
Yeah.
Because my glasses are much, much better now than they were 40 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
So I have much higher index of refraction glasses. So,
but in fact, you're legally blind.
Well, I've sort of my new glasses. I'm no longer legally blind.
Okay.
I was riding my motorcycle for many years legally blind, but my new glasses sort of moved me out of that category.
I see.
Still pretty bad, but
But for most of your life, I gather, you were legally blind.
That's right.
Yeah. And so here you are, a legally blind physicist doing ESP research.
And when I moved to California, I went to a lecture at Stanford University where Professor Jeffrey Smith was talking about research in parapsychology. And he's a very gentle professor of religion, and people were picking on him, sort of heckling him. And he was lecturing about stuff that I actually knew quite a lot more about than he did. And I sort of helped him from the floor. And after his lecture, I said, why don't we create a parapsychology group for interested people? And he thought that would be a good idea. And he was already working with Charlie Targ, who was a graduate student there getting his PhD, and Arthur Hastings, who was a professor there. It's possible Charlie got his PhD at Duke University and was a postdoc at Stanford. But we formed this little group with Jeffrey Smith, who was a distinguished professor, Charlie Targ, Arthur Hastings, and myself, and we created something called Parapsychology Research Group.
Yes, which I later became involved in myself for many years. And in the Bay Area of California, it was the I suppose you'd say, the premier gathering place for people seriously interested in parapsychology.
And out of that, I met a young engineer, David Hurt, who was really an electronic engineer genius. And I had the idea to build a ESP teaching machine to help people develop their psychic skills. Yeah. And David built a 4-choice trainer for me. You choose one of 4 buttons, red, blue, yellow, or green.
That are selected at random by the machine.
That's right. And it had a pass button, so this was not forced choice.
You had the option to pass if you didn't feel confident.
And we found that offering feedback and reinforcement and a pass option, people could actually get more than you would think is correct.
So, and I gather by now we're sort of up to, what, the 1960s or
That's right, mid-60s. And I presented this at a workshop at Esalen Institute, the hot baths in Southern California. Yeah. And I had a number of these machines and was showing people how to use them. And Mike Murphy was there, who was the owner of Esalen, a great pioneer in consciousness research. And the following month, Mike Murphy said, I'm supposed to give a talk on parapsychology worldwide at Grace Cathedral, and I can't give it. Russ, could you talk about physics in America and the Soviet Union as you did at Esalen? And I said I certainly could give that talk at Grace Cathedral. And I did that the following week. In my audience was a NASA administrator, George Pezdertz, who was the administrator for new products, new ideas. And he liked my talk, and George said, can you come to a conference we're having on speculative technology, St. Simon Island, in 2 weeks from now, the beginning of May. So it's amazing how one thing leads to another. So I said, yes, George, I'd be very happy to do that. Can I bring my ESP machine that I'm demonstrated? Yeah. He thought that would be terrific. So at St. Simon Island, I had a chance to meet Werner von Braun. Von Braun did extremely well with this 4-choice trainer. But from my point of view, he went to the director of NASA and said, I think this guy has a good idea. Why don't you give him a few bucks? So he told the NASA chief administrator, why don't you support me?
Well, Russell, what a fascinating adventure this has been. Our time is up for now, but we're going to do more interviews, and I know we've hardly scratched the surface. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you. I'm very happy for the opportunity.
And thank you for being with us.